Thank you so much. It is truly a delight to be here back in the Carolinas. I'm originally from Anderson, South Carolina, and so I would have fond memory of coming to Asheville when I was living in South Carolina and having come to Asheville since then. And so this is just a wonderful delight to see all you here for this talk on Zora Neale Hurston's life and her works, and an emphasis on dust tracks on a road. So my acknowledgments to the North Carolina Humanities Council, Buncombe County Government, the Woman Dykeman Legacy, the West Asheville Library, and all of you here, and to Zora. Okay. So I thought I would incorporate into the presentation some images from books that I have published about Zora Neale Hurston, as was mentioned before, and this is Zora Neale Hurston, a literary reference to her life and work. So in this book, I talk a lot about, or write a lot about her short fiction, her drama, her novels, and there are also entries and parts on other people and places that were significant to the life of Zora Neale Hurston. And this project, I was contacted by an editor with Salem Press who asked me if I'd be interested in editing a collection of essays on Zora Neale Hurston. And there were some books of essays that were already in existence on Zora Neale Hurston, but some of them were older collections of essays. So I sent out a call and got a number of submissions. So this book came out a few years ago, and we're really excited that we were able to include some more recent scholarship on Zora Neale Hurston's works. This is an anthology that I co-edited with Rochelle Smith, who at the time was a professor at the University of Mississippi. She also went to graduate school at the University of Georgia, and so I knew her from then. And this is an anthology that includes poetry, drama, fiction, and also a CD with the oral tradition, also visual art by African American writers from the 1700s to the present. And it has all of Zora Neale Hurston's novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, in it. So we're able to get copyright permission for the entire novel. In fact, it has a number of complete works in that anthology, and was adopted as a textbook at several places. I believe University of Texas, Austin, it was used as a textbook there. Indiana University, Bloomington, it was used as a textbook there, and some other places. And this one, Rereading the Harlem Renaissance, it really is a comparison of the works of Jessie Fawcett, Zora Neale Hurston, and Dorothy West. And a lot of times when people look at women writers of the Harlem Renaissance, they often look at them in opposition to each other in some ways. But what I was really interested in was kind of the linkages between Jessie Fawcett, Zora Neale Hurston, and Dorothy West thematically and even in their lives. And so this is just some more information about my selected relevant publications about those writers and also the anthology. So I spent some time in Florida a few years ago. I decided to go on a sort of pilgrimage inspired by Zora Neale Hurston. And so I went to Eatonville, Florida. And I remember I told people I'm flying to Orlando. And a lot of people, told me about places they'd gone to in Orlando. And I said, yes, I'm excited about going to Orlando. I said, but I'm also going to make sure that I make it down to Eatonville, Florida. So there is a museum in Eatonville, Florida, named after Zora Neale Hurston, the Zora Neale Hurston National Museum of Fine Arts. And it's a wonderful place to visit, and I got to talk to the person who was in charge of it. If you go down to Eatonville, which is a very small town, you do get the sense of a small town community, and also a place that is really proud of its association with Zora Neale Hurston. And you may be aware that there's a very popular Zora Neale Hurston Festival that has been an annual festival that people come. It's sort of a celebration of African American cultural heritage. I also made my way down to, on my way to Fort Pierce, Florida. If you go to Fort Pierce, they have a lot of markers that are dedicated to sites connected or relevant to Zora Neale Hurston. And so I went to some of those sites, and this is a library in Fort Pierce that is named after Zora Neale Hurston. So I went there on a Saturday, and it was packed with people of a variety of ages. It was a really bustling place. They had some beautiful artwork dedicated to Zora Neale Hurston. So I thought, how fitting to have a library named after such an esteemed writer. And then while I was there, I also visited this marker here, this sort of gravesite marker, and you can see how they have highlighted it here with information about Zora Neale Hurston. So there are various markers in different places in Fort Pierce, Florida. I will say that when I was in Eatonville, Florida, I spent time at a restaurant. I think it was called the Be Back Cafe, and I think the New York Times article said it's so good, you'll be back. That's where it came from. I think the article I read said that's where, the idea came from. And the person who, when I went to the restaurant in Eatonville, I met a man who I believe runs it, and he's a former mayor, and he was such a marvelous storyteller. And I just think about Zora's penchant for storytelling, and I think, she got it honest, because even just a few years ago, they have some marvelous storytellers in Eatonville, Florida. So that said, Zora Neale Hurston's biographical information is quite fascinating. For one thing, if you in Dust Tracks on the Road, it's presented that she was basically born in Eatonville, Florida. However, a number of scholars have pointed out that she was actually born in Notasulga, Alabama. There's evidence to point to that. And you can see the birth date of 1891. And so if you do research on Zora Neale Hurston, you might come across that she was born in 1901 or maybe even beyond that. Some people speculate that she liked to shave some years off of her age, And I said, I'm not mad at her. I've done that myself. So we have 1891 and Notasulga, Alabama. And there's been, some speculation on why the disparity between the self-representation of being, born in Eatonville versus, scholarship pointing to her having been born in Notasulga, Alabama. Some people suggest that it's because Eatonville was considered to be an all-black town. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance. She was very proud of African-American heritage. She liked the idea of having been born in Eatonville. And so despite her having been born in Notasulga, they still, have this Zora Neale Hurston Festival. And so maybe you could just say that Eatonville was her birthplace as an author, that kind of idea. Throughout her life, she had a number of travels. You can see here she attended Morgan Academy in Maryland, Howard Prep School, and also Howard University. And those were not the only schools that she attended, but I've just mentioned those here. Some of her early publications include John Redding Goes to Sea, which was published in Stylus magazine, which was a very important magazine at Howard University. Okay, so we know that when she was a student at Howard, she was interested in publishing and very engaged in a literary world. And then Spunk was also a story that was published in Opportunity magazine, Opportunity published by the NAACP, by the Urban League. And you can see also that she attended Barnard College, and I'm going to talk about that later because she helped integrate Barnard College in New York, and also was involved with a magazine called Fire, and issues of Fire literally caught on fire. So that's important publication associated with the Harlem Renaissance. Sometimes when I'm teaching her text, people ask me a lot of questions about her personal life. She was married more than once. She married Herbert Sheen. And one thing we find in her narrative is a lot of times the tension between balancing her career and also her romantic life. I also have the reference here to Charlotte Osgood Mason, who was a wealthy patron of the arts in New York, a socialite who was very much interested in African American culture and Native American culture, and she provided funding for a number of people, including Zora Neale Hurston, and her nickname was Godmother. You can see the going to Barnard and earning the degree, separating from Sheen. She collaborated with Langston Hughes on a play called Mulebone in 1930. I've taught Mulebone, and Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, who's also seen as one of the key figures of the Harlem Renaissance, Hughes being someone who wrote fiction, poetry, literary criticism, who wrote drama, notable for his blues and jazz-inspired writing. And I'm a former president of the Langston Hughes Society and former vice president. They did collaborate on the play Mulebone. She did a lot to promote Langston Hughes's writing when she would travel various places, but they had a very heated falling out. And so in many ways that's quite unfortunate. You can see that she got a divorce from Herbert Sheen in 1931. 1934 marks the publication of Jonas Gordvine, which is a very interesting story with that particular text. It is actually influenced by the life of her father, who was a pastor, and she and her father had a very complicated type of relationship. Her mother could be very encouraging to her, and in Death Strikes on a Road, it's noted that her father felt that she needed to be careful about having too much ambition. Who knows what will happen to you if you have too much ambition, as opposed to her mother, who told her to jump at the sun. Okay. And then you can see in the 1930s, her interest in anthropology, graduate study, her interest in starting graduate study at Columbia University. Her work with the Works Progress Administration is very important. A number of writers during the Great Depression were involved with it, and this becomes very important for Zora Neale Hurston, too, in terms of a lot of her collecting of history and folkloric type texts. You can see that in 1936, she spent some time in Jamaica, and in 1937, she wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, which appeared later that year, and appeared as several weeks in Haiti. And of course, she writes about that in Death Strikes on a Road. And Their Eyes Are Watching God is probably her best known novel. And of course, it focuses on a woman named Janie Crawford and her quest for self and love and her relationships with three men: her first husband, Logan Killix, her second husband, Joe Starks, who was the mayor of Eatonville, and Zora Neale Hurston's father was mayor of Eatonville. And then the love of her life, Virgil Tea Cake Woods. And so it sort of follows her. It was also made into a television movie. Oprah Winfrey was an executive producer for the movie, and it was a very highly rated television movie when it premiered on ABC. And Halle Berry played the protagonist, Janie Crawford, and Ruby Dee, who has since passed on, played the grandmother. And so that really helped bring a lot of attention to that text. She married Albert Price. She had employment with a college in North Carolina. So interesting kind of connections between Zora Neale Hurston and North Carolina. Her book, Moses, Man of the Mountain, which really was a retelling of the story about Moses from the Old Testament of the Bible, was published in 1939. If you look at her novels, they're biblical and religious allusions or references. Jonas Gordvine, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Moses, Man of the Mountain, and Seraph on the Swanee. So I think a lot of the early influence with her father having been a pastor affected her writing and also her own research. You can see in the 1940s she spent some time in South Carolina engaged in research in the Beaufort, South Carolina area. You can see her work with Dust Tracks on the Road during the 1940s. Hurston also spent some time in California with work for Paramount Pictures. And so it's interesting the number of writers who were out in California or interested in writing for the movies. William Faulkner did some writing for the movies. So we can see Dust Tracks on the Road appearing in publication 1942. She divorced Price. And then 1947, the publication of Seraph on the Swanee. And in the early 1950s, she published with the Saturday Evening Post. In addition to being a novelist, a playwright, a poet, an anthropologist, she also worked for the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper and covered a very famous case of a woman who was on trial for murder. And some people feel like Hurston's coverage and her involvement really helped the woman in the outcome. In 1950s, she worked for a library. She also taught. She had serious medical problems in 1959, and she passed away in 1960. Alice Walker purchased a marker in honor of Hurston in 1973, and as Alice Walker tells it, she goes down to Florida, pretends to be a relative of Zora Hurston, even though she wasn't, and she was really committed to this idea of getting this marker. And so Alice Walker, who's probably best known for her novel The Color Purple, but has written numerous novels and books, has credited Hurston as being one of her main influences. And I would say in terms of the revival of interest in Zora Neale Hurston, we can credit Alice Walker for her writings about Zora Neale Hurston, and also Robert Hemingway for his biography of Hurston. We also can credit a number of people at colleges and universities and elsewhere who were really dedicated to reviving and resuscitating her memory and her reputation. Okay, so just some information about where that